God specializes in beginning where life seems to have ended. That is his divine signature. When everything is dead, decayed, and dismissed as hopeless, that's where God is just getting started. He doesn't need life to bring life. He is life. When man sees a dead place, God sees raw material. God doesn't show up when everything is perfect. He waits until everything has failed. He steps into the moment after you've cried your last tear, after the last door has been shut, after everyone has walked away. When the curtain has closed, God steps onto the stage. This is the nature of how the divine moves. Man celebrates beginnings, but God waits for endings, not because he enjoys your suffering, but because his glory is only fully seen when nothing else can take the credit. God doesn't need to compete with your options. He waits until your plan is buried, your strength is exhausted, your confidence is bankrupt. Then he steps in and says, "Now watch me work." That's not punishment, that's pattern. He did it with Abraham. He waited until Sarah's womb was dead, until the natural order had no hope, until time itself had passed them by. Then he said, "I'll give you a son." Why? Because if Sarah could have given birth at 30, they would have said biology did it. But when she gave birth at 90, they could only say, "God did it." See, dead places are not divine refusals. They are divine invitations. An invitation for God to reveal himself as more than enough. He doesn't enter your story to make it better. He enters to prove that he is the story. When the children of Israel were trapped between Pharaoh and the Red Sea, they were in a dead place. There was no way forward, no way back. That's where God proved himself. He said, "Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord." Not fight, not run. Stand still, because this battle isn't about your strength. It's about his glory. You've been trying to move a mountain that only responds to resurrection power. You've been trying to fix a situation that was never meant to be fixed. It was meant to die, so that God could prove he is the resurrection and the life. Some things in your life had to die so that you would stop depending on them. You thought it was betrayal, but it was surgery. God was removing your false dependencies. He was cutting off every idol. He was shaking every false foundation. Because God cannot build on what man has built. He only builds on what has been torn down. That's why dead places are sacred ground. That's where the oil flows. That's where the voice of God is clearest. You've been looking for God in the noise of success, but he's been waiting for you in the silence of the tomb. That tomb isn't a prison, it's a portal. Lazarus heard the voice of God from inside a grave. You think you're buried, but God says you're planted, and what has been planted must break before it rises. The dirt isn't your death, it's your womb. This is why God lets things die. Not to hurt you, but to hide you. He hides his greatest works in the dark. Seeds don't grow in the light. They grow in silence. In pressure, in depth. The deeper the burial, the higher the rise. When Joseph was thrown in a pit, he wasn't being punished. He was being positioned, because dead places are wombs for destiny. He had to go down before he could go up. He had to lose his coat before he could gain his crown. That prison was the passage to the palace. You've been crying over what you lost, but God is rejoicing over what he's about to reveal. Stop looking at the stone. Stop looking at the grave clothes. Stop rehearsing the death. God says, "I am not intimidated by what's dead. I created life from dust. I built a man out of dirt and breath, and I can do more with your ashes than you ever did with your strength." But the problem is, we don't like dead places. We avoid them, we sanitize them. We bury our pain instead of bringing it to the altar. And so, we never see the power of God because we are too committed to preserving what God is trying to resurrect. You keep asking God to bless what he's trying to kill. You keep praying for him to heal what he's trying to replace. Let it die, because God only proves himself in places we've surrendered. He doesn't perform in your pride. He manifests in your surrender, and that surrender often feels like death. It's the end of your control. It's the burial of your ego, but that is the place where the supernatural begins. Look at Jesus. The cross was the ultimate dead place. It was bloody, it was ugly, it was hopeless, but God didn't stop the crucifixion. He used it, because the proof of his power required a death. Resurrection doesn't happen in a hospital. It happens in a tomb. You can't skip the grave and get to glory. And if you're in a season where everything feels dead, you are exactly where God wants to prove himself. You don't need a better situation. You need a fresh revelation, the revelation that God does his best work in ruins, that his miracles are born in messes, that his glory is not intimidated by what looks impossible. You're praying for God to remove the storm, but he wants to reveal his voice in the storm. You're asking him to take away the fire, but he wants to walk with you in the fire, because fire proves what is real. Fire reveals what is pure. Fire burns off what can't go into your next season. God is not avoiding your dead place. He's already there, waiting, watching, whispering, saying, "Roll away the stone." He didn't need the stone moved for Lazarus. He needed it moved for the witnesses, because some people can't believe until they see what God can do in a dead place. That's why he's allowing it to happen publicly, because the same people who saw your death will have to witness your resurrection. The ones who laughed will be the first to worship. The ones who buried you will have to testify that you got up. And when you rise, it won't be by might nor by power, but by the Spirit of God. This isn't a self-help gospel. This is a resurrection gospel. This isn't about you pulling yourself up. It's about you lying still while God breathes again. Some of you are trying too hard to live when God is saying, "Die, so I can raise you. Surrender, so I can show you what you were really born to do. You weren't made to survive. You were made to rise." But you cannot rise until you've been still. You cannot ascend until you've descended. You cannot wear the crown until you've borne the cross. So don't fear the dead places. Don't resist the silence. Don't despise the breaking, because that's where God proves himself. Not in your strength, but in your surrender. Not in your wisdom, but in your weakness. He is not the God who needs perfect circumstances. He's the God who brings order to chaos, light to darkness, life to dust. If you're standing in the middle of a dead marriage, a dead dream, a dead faith, don't run, stay, watch, listen, because God is about to prove that he is who he says he is. Not when things are easy, but when they are dead. Purpose does not die in a grave it waits for resurrection. What God places inside you is not seasonal, it is eternal. Circumstances can change, people can walk away, time can pass, but purpose remains untouched. It may go underground, but it never disappears. Just because something is buried doesn't mean it's dead, and just because it's dead doesn't mean it's finished. Purpose has a resurrection schedule. It is not controlled by your age, your failure, your pain, or your timeline. It is controlled by the God who declared the end from the beginning. There are people walking through life thinking they missed their moment, as if purpose was a one-time opportunity that vanished because of one bad decision or one closed door. But divine purpose is not fragile. It is not dependent on your perfection. It was written before you were born, before you had a past, before you knew your own name. You were created on purpose, for purpose, and with purpose. And what God purposes, he also preserves, even if it's buried under shame, even if it's lying dormant under years of silence, even if it's covered by failure, regret, addiction, or rejection. Purpose does not die. Ask Moses, 40 years in the desert, running from the blood on his hands and the confusion in his heart. People would have said he was done, that his purpose expired, that killing that Egyptian erased everything God planned for him. But purpose doesn't die in exile. It doesn't die in the desert. It waits for a burning bush, waits for divine timing, waits for your ears to finally hear what your heart was born to do. And when the time comes, purpose speaks again. Go back to Egypt. Go back to the place of your failure. Go back to the place where you lost everything. Go back and deliver a nation, because you were never just a shepherd. You were a liberator in disguise. The desert was only the dressing room. See, purpose is not based on your comfort. It's based on your calling, and calling will haunt you even in dead places. It will whisper to you when you're tired. It will stir you in seasons of silence. It will call your name even from under the soil of disappointment. Joseph's purpose was to rule, but the road took him through betrayal, slavery, and prison. Yet the dream never died. The dream was not tied to his location. It was tied to his identity. You can strip the robe, but you can't erase the dream. You can throw him in a pit, but you can't cancel what God showed him, because purpose is prophetic. It declares what shall be, even when nothing around you agrees. And when God speaks purpose, he is not looking for your situation to validate it. He is looking for your faith to protect it. Your faith becomes the womb where purpose grows, even in the dark. Even in delay, even in death. Sarah laughed when she heard the promise, because everything in her body said it was impossible. But what she didn't realize is that purpose overrides biology. Purpose overrides age. Purpose overrides menopause. Purpose overrides every diagnosis. Purpose is not limited by time. It's fulfilled in time, and when the appointed time comes, what was hidden will be revealed. What was buried will rise. That's why the enemy attacks your belief, not just your circumstances. He wants you to give up on what's already alive, to walk away from what's still waiting. He wants you to assume it's over, so that you stop preparing. Because preparation is proof of expectation, and if you stop expecting, you stop becoming. But God is saying, don't bury what I'm about to raise. Don't eulogize what I've only silenced. Don't quit on what I'm still building. What you call delay, he calls development. What you call dead, he calls dormant. Like a seed under the soil, the silence is not the absence of life. It's the incubation of purpose. There are some people who had to walk away from you because they were not assigned to your resurrection. They could only handle your potential, not your process. They could celebrate your idea, but not your isolation. They loved you when you were promising, but disappeared when you looked dead, and that's fine. Because when God resurrects purpose, he removes the crowd. Jesus waited until Lazarus was sick. Then he waited until he died. Then he waited until he stank. Because sometimes God allows things to get worse before he reveals his best. He lets it die so that no one else can take the credit. He waits until all hope is gone, so when the miracle comes, no one can say it was the medicine or the money. It had to be God, and when he said, "Lazarus, come forth," it wasn't just a man rising. It was purpose rising. It was destiny standing up again. That man had died, but his purpose hadn't. It was waiting on the voice of God, waiting for the timing of heaven, waiting for the moment when purpose could not be denied. And that moment will come in your life too, the moment when the vision breathes again, when the dream starts to stir, when the thing you thought you lost starts walking again, but you must protect your faith in the silence. You must refuse to bury what God never finished. There's something inside you that won't let you rest, a holy discomfort, a divine dissatisfaction, a sense that no matter how still it seems, something is alive. That is your purpose breathing. Even in the tomb, it's breathing. Even after the heartbreak, it's breathing. Even after the bankruptcy, the divorce, the rejection, the silence, it's still breathing, because God doesn't abort what he authors. He watches over his word to perform it, and his word does not return void. It may delay, it may detour, it may even die, but it will not return void. There's a reason why you're still here. A reason the accident didn't kill you. A reason the depression didn't consume you. A reason you didn't give up when everything told you to. That reason is purpose. Purpose protects you in storms you don't even know about. Purpose fights for you when you've stopped fighting for yourself. Purpose covers you when you're vulnerable, lifts you when you're tired, and calls to you when you've gone numb. Purpose is the echo of eternity inside your humanity. It reminds you that you were sent, not just born. Assigned, not just placed. Called, not just conceived. You were not a mistake. You were a mission, and missions don't die. They get fulfilled, even if they pass through dark valleys, deep pits, and sealed tombs. God is not finished with what he started. He is not intimidated by what looks lifeless. In fact, he prefers to work in the impossible. So if your purpose looks dead, congratulations. You're a perfect candidate for a resurrection. Just don't disconnect from the source. Don't let bitterness bury you. Don't let delay deceive you. Don't let failure define you. You are not what you've been through. You are what you were sent to do. And what you were sent to do will speak again. When David was forgotten in the field, purpose found him. When Esther was hidden in a palace, purpose called her name. When Ruth was gleaning in someone else's field, purpose was preparing her for her own. When Peter was fishing in failure, purpose was waiting on the shore. And when Jesus was lying lifeless in the tomb, purpose was planning a 3-day comeback. The grave was not the end, it was the transition. And so it is with you. The moment you align with this truth, something will start to shift. Not always externally, but internally. The fire will return, the vision will refocus, the passion will reignite. Not because everything has changed around you, but because something has come alive within you. That's purpose. It has no expiration date. It has no competitor, and it has no equal. It is the breath of God inside your calling. And it waits, not for man's permission, but for God's timing. And when that moment comes, no tomb, no stone, no silence, and no demon can hold it down. God does not require your capability. He demands your availability. What you see as a limitation, God sees as a doorway. He is not impressed by your strengths. He's attracted to your weaknesses. He chooses the weak things of the world to confound the strong, the foolish things to shame the wise. Why? Because when strength is absent, glory is present. Your limitation is not a liability. It's an announcement that God is about to step in and demonstrate that what you can't do, he never needed you to. When you come to the end of yourself, that's when the power of God begins. But the problem is, we spend most of our lives trying to cover our limitations, mask our insufficiencies, and protect our image. We don't want to look broken. We don't want to appear weak. But the moment you embrace your lack is the moment God activates his fullness. Moses said, I can't speak. And God said, I'll give you words. Gideon said, I'm the least in my family. And God said, that's why I chose you. Jeremiah said, I'm too young. And God said, don't say that. I put my word in your mouth. Over and over, God chooses the unlikely, the unqualified, the underestimated. Not because he needs their help, but because he wants the world to see his hand. Your limitation is God's canvas. It's the space where heaven paints its masterpiece. If you had all the answers, there would be no room for revelation. If you had all the resources, there would be no need for provision. If you had all the wisdom, there would be no dependence on the Spirit. So God allows the lack to remain, not to torment you, but to teach you how to lean, not to punish you, but to prepare you. Your lack is not a curse. It's a compass. It points you back to the throne. Some of the greatest moves of God in your life will happen through the areas you're most ashamed of. You think he's going to use your strength, your education, your connections. But he's after that place you've been hiding, that thing you keep trying to fix before he calls you. But what if he's calling you with it? What if he's not waiting on you to overcome it, but to surrender it? Because your weakness, fully surrendered, becomes the very tool God uses to display his dominion. Paul prayed 3 times for the thorn to be removed. But God said, no, my grace is sufficient. My strength is made perfect in your weakness. In other words, Paul, your thorn doesn't disqualify you. It qualifies you, because when you feel most broken, you become most usable. God will never allow you to become so strong that you no longer need Him. He will always leave a reminder, a dependency, a place of humility, because that's the place where His power dwells. It's not your perfection that attracts His presence. It's your dependency. That's why Jesus came for the sick, not the well. For the broken, not the proud. For the desperate, not the self-sufficient. When the woman with the issue of blood crawled through the crowd, it was her limitation that drove her to Jesus, and it was her faith, born out of desperation, that healed her. Some of you are one moment of honest surrender away from a miracle, but you're still trying to impress God with what He already knows you don't have. You don't need to be enough. You just need to believe that He is. Stop waiting to be perfect before you step into your purpose. You're not called because you're capable. You're called because He's faithful. David wasn't the oldest, the tallest, or the most qualified. He was forgotten in a field, but what man overlooked, God anointed, because purpose is not based on presentation. It's based on preparation, and God will prepare you in obscurity, so that when He promotes you, no man can take the credit. Your limitation creates the stage for divine power. That's why the widow had only a jar of oil. That's why the disciples had only 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's why Peter had fished all night and caught nothing. Because God waits until your options run out, then He shows up and says, "Now I'll do it my way." And when He does it His way, you'll know it wasn't your skill, your connections, or your education. It was grace. It was favor. It was divine interruption. So stop running from your limitations. Embrace them, because they are not your prison. They are your invitation. God is not looking for a flawless vessel. He's looking for a surrendered one that says, "Lord, I don't have much, but I give you what I do have." And that offering, no matter how small, becomes enough when placed in the hands of a limitless God. Keynote 4, God never avoids dead things. He speaks into them when God sees death. He doesn't turn away. He leans in. He is not intimidated by what man calls final. He is not disturbed by stench, decay, or silence. He speaks to dry bones. He walks into tombs. He commands winds and waves. He engages chaos. He interrupts funerals. Because dead things are not barriers to Him, they are targets. He doesn't whisper around graves. He speaks into them, loudly, boldly, authoritatively, because His word does not consult death before it brings life. The enemy wants you to think that once something is dead, it's out of reach, that the tomb is the end, that silence means absence. But God has a history of speaking in dead places. He created light in darkness. He created man from dust. He called Lazarus by name from within a grave. He told Ezekiel to prophesy to bones scattered across a valley, not because the bones could hear, but because the word of God transcends death. What God speaks to must respond, whether it's living or dead. Your dead place is not beyond God's voice. Your dead dream, your dead relationship, your dead faith. It's all within range of His word. But the question is, can you still believe while it looks lifeless? Can you still prophesy when all you see is bones? That's what God asked Ezekiel. Can these bones live? And Ezekiel didn't pretend to know. He said, "Lord, you know." That's the posture of trust, the posture that doesn't demand evidence. It just obeys the instruction. And the instruction was simple. Speak to what's dead, not about it, not around it, to it, because faith is not afraid of death. Faith speaks life into what looks final. Jesus didn't walk around the tomb of Lazarus. He stood at the entrance and shouted into it, because divine authority doesn't flinch at the impossible. When God speaks, the impossible becomes obligated. Death loses its grip. The grave gives up what it tried to keep. Because the Word of God carries life in every syllable. When God speaks into a dead thing, time reverses, cells respond, atmospheres shift. What was decomposing begins reconstructing. That's not poetic. It's divine reality. You think it's too late, but God doesn't need time to function. He steps outside of it, then speaks into it, and when he speaks, time obeys, delay bows, decay stops. What you thought was buried forever begins to breathe again. That's why you can never count God out of a dead situation. He waits until the funeral procession has begun. Then he disrupts it with resurrection power. The widow of Nain was on her way to bury her son. No one invited Jesus to the funeral, but he intercepted it anyway because his compassion is drawn to pain and his power is drawn to death. He touched the coffin, not because he needed to, but because everything he touches must live. And that boy got up, not because of anyone's faith, but because of divine compassion and the authority of a living word. That's what makes Jesus different. He doesn't avoid your dead places. He moves toward them. Some of you have been hiding your dead places from God, as if he'll be disappointed. But he already knows. He's just waiting for you to roll away the stone of pride, the stone of unbelief, the stone of bitterness, and when you move it, he'll speak, not in judgment, but in resurrection, not to condemn, but to call forth. God does not speak into dead places to remind you of what you lost. He speaks to restore what you forgot was still alive. But sometimes, before he speaks, he asks you to speak, to open your mouth and declare what he's already said, not because he needs your help, but because your agreement activates the miracle. Life and death are in the power of the tongue, not just his, but yours. You're waiting on God to speak, and he's waiting on you to repeat what he already said. Speak to the dry bones. Speak to your own soul. Speak to your future. Speak to the lifeless areas of your assignment. Because when you echo his voice, the atmosphere has to respond. Dead things don't scare God. They reveal him. They become stages for his glory. So don't avoid them. Don't bury them before he speaks. Wait, listen, and when you hear him, repeat what he says, because one word from his mouth is enough to rewrite everything death tried to declare. The grave doesn't get the last word. God does. When God sees death, he doesn't turn away. He leans in. He is not intimidated by what man calls final. He is not disturbed by stench, decay, or silence. He speaks to dry bones. He walks into tombs. He commands winds and waves. He engages chaos. He interrupts funerals because dead things are not barriers to him. They are targets. He doesn't whisper around graves. He speaks into them. Loudly, boldly, authoritatively, because his word does not consult death before it brings life. The enemy wants you to think that once something is dead, it's out of reach, that the tomb is the end, that silence means absence. But God has a history of speaking in dead places. He created light in darkness. He created man from dust. He called Lazarus by name from within a grave. He told Ezekiel to prophesy to bones scattered across a valley, not because the bones could hear, but because the word of God transcends death. What God speaks to must respond, whether it's living or dead. Your dead place is not beyond God's voice. Your dead dream, your dead relationship, your dead faith. It's all within range of his word. But the question is, can you still believe while it looks lifeless? Can you still prophesy when all you see is bones? That's what God asked Ezekiel. Can these bones live? And Ezekiel didn't pretend to know. He said, Lord, you know. That's the posture of trust, the posture that doesn't demand evidence. It just obeys the instruction, and the instruction was simple. Speak to what's dead, not about it, not around it, to it, because faith is not afraid of death. Faith speaks life into what looks final. Jesus didn't walk around the tomb of Lazarus. He stood at the entrance and shouted into it. Because divine authority doesn't flinch at the impossible. When God speaks, the impossible becomes obligated. Death loses its grip. The grave gives up what it tried to keep, because the word of God carries life in every syllable. When God speaks into a dead thing, time reverses. Cells respond. Atmospheres shift. What was decomposing begins reconstructing. That's not poetic. It's divine reality. You think it's too late, but God doesn't need time to function. He steps outside of it, then speaks into it. And when he speaks, time obeys, delay bows, decay stops. What you thought was buried forever begins to breathe again. That's why you can never count God out of a dead situation. He waits until the funeral procession has begun, then he disrupts it with resurrection power. The widow of Nain was on her way to bury her son. No one invited Jesus to the funeral, but he intercepted it anyway, because his compassion is drawn to pain, and his power is drawn to death. He touched the coffin, not because he needed to, but because everything he touches must live. And that boy got up, not because of anyone's faith, but because of divine compassion and the authority of a living word. That's what makes Jesus different. He doesn't avoid your dead places, he moves toward them. Some of you have been hiding your dead places from God, as if he'll be disappointed, but he already knows. He's just waiting for you to roll away the stone of pride, the stone of unbelief. The stone of bitterness, and when you move it, he'll speak. Not in judgment, but in resurrection, not to condemn, but to call forth. God does not speak into dead places to remind you of what you lost. He speaks to restore what you forgot was still alive. But sometimes, before he speaks, he asks you to speak, to open your mouth and declare what he's already said, not because he needs your help, but because your agreement activates the miracle. Life and death are in the power of the tongue. Not just his, but yours. You're waiting on God to speak, and he's waiting on you to repeat what he already said. Speak to the dry bones. Speak to your own soul. Speak to your future. Speak to the lifeless areas of your assignment, because when you echo his voice, the atmosphere has to respond. Dead things don't scare God. They reveal him. They become stages for his glory. So don't avoid them. Don't bury them before he speaks. Wait, listen, and when you hear him, repeat what he says, because one word from his mouth is enough to rewrite everything death tried to declare. The grave doesn't get the last word, God does. The grave is not an end, it's a beginning. In the kingdom of God, death is not a termination, it's a transformation. Every burial holds within it the promise of a bloom. What man calls the end, God calls the planting. And what's planted must rise. That's why the resurrection wasn't a one-time event. It was a pattern, a spiritual law, a divine rhythm. If it dies in God, it will live again. If it falls into the ground as a seed, it will bear fruit. God doesn't waste graves, he gardens with them. You've been crying over what was buried, not realizing that the burial was part of the blueprint. Jesus said, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. He didn't just talk about death. He revealed process, because God doesn't bury you to forget you. He buries you to multiply you. The dirt wasn't rejection. It was protection. The covering wasn't abandonment. It was preparation. The silence wasn't punishment. It was fertilization. Every grave in your life is an invitation to resurrection power, but resurrection doesn't happen in the absence of death. It requires it. It feeds on it. Resurrection is not a detour. It is destiny. Jesus didn't avoid the cross. He walked toward it, because he understood that the garden on the other side required the grave. You can't have new life without death to the old. You can't have fruit without first losing the seed. So stop trying to avoid the death of your old season. Embrace it. Mourn it if you must, but don't fight it, because God is growing something under the soil. It's in the grave that roots go deep. That identity is secured. That character is forged. That dependency is built. You think nothing is happening, but underground everything is shifting. The seed doesn't need light to grow. It needs surrender. It needs trust, it needs time, and God is not in a rush, because what grows quickly doesn't last long, but what grows in silence, in surrender, in the secret place, cannot be shaken. That's why the enemy fights you hardest after a burial. Because he knows what's coming. He knows that what looks like the end is actually the explosion of something unstoppable. You are not dying. You are germinating. You are not being punished. You are being planted. The dirt on your dream isn't there to suffocate it. It's there to cover it while it becomes what it was destined to be. That relationship that ended, that job that closed, that ministry that paused. Don't call it a coffin. Call it a seedbed, because when God gets involved, nothing stays dead. He calls forth beauty from ashes, life from lifelessness, gardens from graves. That's why the tomb of Jesus was placed in a garden. Because what looked like defeat was really harvest. The angels didn't appear with sadness. They appeared with power, because heaven doesn't cry at graves. It prepares for growth. When you see a stone rolled in front, heaven sees it rolled away. When you see a body lying still, heaven sees a seed preparing to burst. When you see silence, heaven hears the sound of roots growing. Heaven doesn't fear the grave, it uses it. It turns it. It transforms it. Your worst day becomes your preparation day. Your heartbreak becomes your harvest. Your burial becomes your breakthrough, not because of your strength, but because of God's divine strategy. He is not afraid of the dark. He is not bound by the soil. He is not silenced by the grave. He speaks in it, breathes in it, works in it, and then brings forth a garden that testifies not just to survival, but to supernatural increase. Revelation is not birthed in comfort. It is born in obscurity. It is not discovered in sunlight. It is revealed in shadow. God does not reveal his greatest truths on the mountaintop, but in the cave. He does not thunder revelation through the crowd, but whispers it in the wilderness. When everything around you goes dark, when you can't see what's next, when every voice has gone silent, God begins to speak, because the absence of distraction creates the atmosphere for instruction. The darkness that makes you uncomfortable is the canvas on which God draws clarity. We think revelation comes in noise and movement and applause, but it rarely does. Most of the time, it comes when you are alone, when you've run out of answers, when you don't know whether to go forward or turn back. That's where God speaks, not in the language of hype, but in the tone of destiny. The deeper the purpose, the darker the place he hides it in. Because revelation is a treasure, and God doesn't leave treasure lying in the open. He conceals it. He buries it in the soil of pain, silence, waiting, and testing. He wraps it in questions. He hides it in dead ends, not to punish you, but to preserve what he's giving you. Some of your greatest encounters with God won't come in church. They'll come in crisis. Not because God delights in your suffering, but because suffering clears the stage of every idol. When you lose what you depended on, you finally hear the one you ignored. When your strength fails, his voice rises. When your plan collapses, his presence becomes unmistakable. That's why some storms don't come to destroy you. They come to isolate you, to cut the noise, to bring you to the place where God doesn't have to compete with your distractions. Ask Elijah. He called fire from heaven in front of a nation, but that wasn't revelation, that was demonstration. Revelation came in the cave, after the earthquake, after the wind, after the fire. Then came the still small voice. Not to entertain the crowd, but to instruct the prophet. The voice didn't show up until Elijah was alone, until he was tired, until he said, "Lord, I've had enough." God said, "Now I can speak." Because until you're empty, you can't receive what's new. God waits for your noise to die so his whisper can live. The darkest seasons are not a punishment, they're preparation. God allows the curtain to close, not to cancel the performance, but to prepare the next scene. And between every act, There is a pause, a moment when the stage is empty and the lights are low. That's what the dark season is. It's the transition, the reset, the moment between who you were and who you're becoming. But in that moment, if you listen, you'll hear things you missed in the light. You'll hear clarity, you'll hear correction, you'll hear calling, not because God wasn't speaking before, but because you weren't quiet enough to hear him. Revelation often comes in the form of questions before it comes in the form of answers. God doesn't always explain. Sometimes he interrogates. Adam, where are you? Elijah, what are you doing here? Who told you that you were naked? These are not information-seeking questions. They are soul-awakening revelations. God uses questions to break your assumptions, to expose your inner dialogue, to shift your lens. Because before he can give you something new, he must empty what's old. The darkness is the place where he reprograms your thinking, where he confronts your illusions, where he plants new vision. You will never come out of darkness the same way you went in. It doesn't just shift what you see, it shifts how you see. It gives you vision that is not based on light, but based on trust. That's why God allowed Joseph to sit in prison for years before the palace. Not because he forgot about him, but because he was forming revelation in him. Vision that could interpret dreams, wisdom that could guide nations, strategy that could save generations, and all of it was conceived in darkness. The prison was not a delay. It was an incubator. The same pattern holds with Paul. He encountered Christ in blinding light, but revelation didn't follow immediately. It followed blindness. For 3 days he saw nothing, and in that blindness God broke his pride, recalibrated his soul, and prepared him for his assignment. His physical eyes were shut, but his spiritual eyes were being opened. Sometimes God has to blind you to what's around you to help you see what's within you, because as long as you can lean on what you see, you'll never trust what he says. Don't curse the darkness. Don't rush out of it. There are some things you can only learn when the lights go out. There are mysteries that only speak in stillness. There are truths that only show up when you stop running. That's why Jacob wrestled at night. That's why God came to Samuel when everyone was asleep. That's why Jesus often went to pray in the early morning before dawn. The dark is not your enemy. It is your classroom. And if you sit still long enough, you will walk out with a word that no devil can erase. God's greatest revelations don't come through your eyes. They come through your spirit, and the spirit is most sensitive when the soul is most surrendered. That's why brokenness often precedes clarity. When your dreams break, when your confidence shatters, when your plans collapse, that's when the veil lifts. That's when heaven begins to download strategy. Not when you're performing, but when you're listening. Not when you're standing tall, but when you're kneeling low. The revelation you receive in darkness will sustain you in the light. It will govern your decisions, guide your relationships, fuel your obedience. Because revelation is not just information, it's direction. It tells you where to go when logic can't lead you. It tells you who to trust when appearances deceive you. It tells you when to wait, when to move, when to speak, and when to be silent. And all of it is refined in the dark.